Hey out there, everyone. Gather round as I tell you a story. My name is Kaiser, and once upon a time in a past life, I was an armament systems technician for the United States Air Force, also known as a weapons troop. I worked on three different airframes during the 8 years that I was in. I did that job for 7 years before cross training into communications. But I worked on the F-16, the A-10, and the F-22 while it was still a test aircraft. And the F-16 was the very first aircraft that I worked on. And I'm going to tell you a story about my first, what they call Viper bite. Because everyone gets a Viper bite. Everyone. Those of you who know, working on the flight line, working around aircraft in general, is inherently dangerous. Airplanes are just dangerous to be around. You cannot be complacent. Safety was paramount for everyone that worked on the flight line. But I remember even in tech school, the instructors would say, you're going to get your first Viper bite. Everyone gets a Viper bite. And I think everyone gets bitten by every aircraft that you work on. But the Viper, the F-16, was of a particular interest when it came to getting Viper bites. Because the aircraft itself was it's very small. Those of you that have seen an F-16 in real life, compared to other aircraft, it's almost tiny. It's a light, nimble fighter jet. Now the F-16 was the first aircraft I ever worked on, so I didn't have a frame of reference to compare it to. But after working on other planes later in my career, I realized, man, the F-16 was really, really small. The wings are much lower than they are on something like the F-15. The wing tips probably come to the top of your head. So a lot of times when you are working on the F-16, you're kind of ducked down because there are the weapon stations and the pylons that are in the way. You could stand up if you're under 6'2", I'd say you could stand up underneath the wing, but you'd have to be careful all the time. And of course, being a new weapons troop, just lack of experience, sometimes you're going to get yourself into some trouble by stepping where you shouldn't be. So I've got many Viper bites over the years. I ended up working on the F-16 for 3 years, 2 years at Shaw Air Force Base, and 1 year with the weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base. And I received many, many Viper bites in my time on that plane. Far more bites than I got working on the A-10 and the F-22. And those will be other stories for other videos. But I'm going to tell you about my very first one because it's a pretty good story, okay? Flashback with me to 1999. This was before my very first deployment, which would come in the fall of that year. I would deploy in October. And it was about June that I got to Shaw Air Force Base. And after doing my weapons loading qualifications, they send you right out to the flight line. So this was kind of this would have been July, August time frame, if I remember correctly. And at the time, we were doing what's called an operational readiness inspection exercise, okay, known as an ORI or ORE, depending on what base you're at. And all this exercise does is you play pretend war at your base. And while you're playing pretend war, you have inspectors, normally from your command, in our case, Air Combat Command, and they would come and they would evaluate our base to determine how combat ready our base was. And the ORIs are a very, very big deal because the ops are a little faster than the day-to-day ops, and you train like you fight. You play like it's real. In particular, as the pace of the sorties and the number of sorties. So injuries do happen during ORIs, and they want to make sure that everyone is as safe as possible during training. But sometimes things do happen, and a lot of times when people get hurt during OREs and ORIs, those incidents come under a microscope. So this was my very first ORI. I had not been working on the aircraft for very, very long. I was super, super wet behind the ears. I mean, I had loaded weapons before. I think I was on day shift at the time, so I was, kind of getting in the groove. But OREs, like I said before, are different than day-to-day ops, and that everything's a lot faster. The jets don't stay in the air as long. The sorties are shorter, so they can run more sorties. So that means that the launches and recoveries happen at a faster pace. So normally, as a weapons troop, what you're doing during the actual launches and recoveries, there's not a whole lot for you to do. The weapons are already loaded, and it is the troops down at end of runway that actually arm up the weapons before takeoff. You don't arm up any of the weapons while it's in the parking spot. There are a few pins that you might pull. I think the pylon pins, we might have pulled those in parking, but for the most part, that's all done at EOR. Okay? So what you do is you assist the crew chief in launching the aircraft and then recovering the aircraft after it lands. Launching the aircraft is pretty easy. You don't do anything except you pull the chocks out of the aircraft, and then you stand by the fire bottle in case there's a fire or an emergency. After you pull the chocks, you stand off to the side of the aircraft. The crew chief disconnects his communications, and then he marshals the aircraft out. But recovering the aircraft, it's a bit more of a process, and I'll try and explain that process so that I want you to get an idea of the steps that you have to go through and why what happened. Okay. So when the aircraft comes in, the crew chief is watching it taxi. He's waiting for it to pull into the parking spot, and you're standing there with the chocks ready. So the crew chief marshals the aircraft straight into the parking spot, and then the pilot, he comes to a stop. Now, from what I understand, and when they investigated this incident, this came up. The pilot is supposed to either keep the toe brakes on or engage the brakes to the point where the aircraft has come to a full and complete stop and is not moving at all. Normally, the pilot will just keep their feet on the toe brakes and leave the aircraft stopped that way. And when the pilot does that, you then run under the jet and you place the front chalk, and then you inspect the wheel for any FOD, rocks. You take a quick look for any damage, and then you pull the front chalk, and then you get out of the way, and the aircraft will roll very slowly forward. The crew chief will march it forward just a few feet, and then the pilot stops, and then you put the chocks for good, and then the pilot begins to shut down procedures, and then anything that's not safed up, you safe the weapons up. Now, if the pilot, when you put that first chock under the wheel, if the pilot lets off the toe brakes, then what happens is the aircraft settles, and the weight of the aircraft kind of goes over that front chalk. And a lot of people don't know this, but when the aircraft configuration is very light, even at idle, the aircraft can move forward very slightly. There's forward momentum on the aircraft even at idle. So what ends up happening is that after the weight settles on that front chalk, it's super, super difficult to pull that front chalk from under the wheel so that the pilot can move forward a few feet. Now, when the pilots come back from sorties, they're tired, and, there's a lot of procedural stuff that they're doing. And so, sometimes, hey, they just take their feet off the brakes, and it happens. It just happens sometimes. that the airplane rolls forward, and then you're like, oh crap, it's gonna be hard to get this chalk out. So normally what you do is you take the rear chalk and you put it up against the front chalk, and then you kick it with your steel toe boot as hard as you can, and then the front chalk will dislodge. Okay, all right, so remember that. Now, underneath the wing of the F-16, like I said, is there's a lot going on. Now, normally at Shaw, our main mission was SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense. So a lot of times, our configuration were A120s on Station 1 and 9, the outside stations, with AIM-9s on Stations 2 and 8. And then there'd be AGM-88 Harms on the inside, and then 4 and 6 would almost always be tanks. Even in the air-to-air configurations, a lot of times they would put tanks on there. And then Station 5 would normally be a jamming pod. Sometimes you would get a fuel tank, but normally I only ever saw fuel tanks if we were going somewhere like TDY or something like that. So in between the fuselage and the fuel tank, there's not a lot of space. And especially once the landing gear doors open, I'm not exaggerating, there might be 6 inches of space in between the landing gear door and where the station, in this case, we'll talk about the Station 4 tank, because I'm on the right side. I'm sorry, the Station 6 tank, because I'm on the right side of the plane. That's normally where you approach the plane and you put the chocks on it. It really doesn't matter what side you do, but this particular time I was on the right side. So there's not a lot of space. So when you're under the inside the landing gear door and you place those chocks and then you pull them, you've got to be able to maneuver safely away from the aircraft so that it can roll forward. I mean, because you don't want to get caught on the landing gear, you get crushed. And you got to be careful if you go straight back out of the aircraft. The horizontal stabilizer is there, and you cannot walk underneath that, because if the pilot bumps the controls, you'll die. So normally you kind of egress away at a 45-degree angle. You back straight out, and then the space in between the wing and the horizontal stabilizer, you just kind of back away from the aircraft at an angle, and then you approach the aircraft from that angle as well. You can't walk out front. If you walk out front of the aircraft, the intake could get you as well, and that would be very messy. So now I knew all of this. Okay, this wasn't foreign to me. I had done a lot of recoveries at this point, because when you're a new weapons troop, that's what you do. You're gonna do all of the shit work, like hey, get out of the truck and catch these aircraft, because you're just a A1C at that point. Okay, so this is during exercise, and so we are the only thing I have on you when you're doing a flight line ops during an exercise, your MOP gear, your chem warfare gear, is kind of off to the side so that it doesn't get in the way and cause accidents. But you do have your gas mask in the holder on you. So and that does make it kind of difficult to move around. It's always getting caught on stuff. I mean, if you're working on something, you can put it down, but you got to have it close to you, because if you get attacked, then you've got to be able to put that gas mask on immediately. And, so that if an inspector sees you and you don't have it on, you could be in some trouble. Okay. So the aircraft pulls into the spot, and I go over to chalk it. So I crouch down between the landing gear door and the fuel tank. I put my chocks in, and I immediately see that the pilot lets off the brakes, because I see the aircraft roll forward slightly and settle on the front chalk. So I'm like, oh, great. This is going to suck, because it's going to be hard to get this chalk out. So I do my check, and then I go and I grab the rear chalk and I place it in the front chalk, and I kick it as hard as I can. Well, when I kicked it and it dislodged the chalk, the aircraft began slowly rolling forward. I don't know if the pilot wasn't in, if he wasn't completely in idle or what, but the aircraft started rolling forward because normally when you pull the chocks, you give a thumbs up to the crew chief and you move out of the way, and then he begins to marshal the aircraft forward. This all happened very quickly, so I'm not sure what happened, but I do know that the aircraft started rolling forward before I was expecting it to. So the aircraft is rolling forward, and now I'm stuck in between this landing gear door and the fuel tank. And I'm like, man, I gotta, I'm thinking the aircraft's rolling forward. I gotta get the hell up out the way. And, you're not supposed to go under any of the stations because, hey, what if they accidentally jettison on top of you? That will probably never happen, but you never know. So I'm thinking, I don't want to go under the fuel tank. And there's not a lot of space between the fuel tank and the ground to go under it. And so, just based on the little bit of experience I had, I just instinctively, okay, I'm going to turn around and back out, from the aircraft at an angle like I always did. The problem is that I timed it wrong and the aircraft was still moving forward. Now on the fuel tanks, there's a little fin on the rear of the fuel tanks. It's very small. It's maybe 5-6 inches long. It's not very big, but it is there. And because I was crouched down, it was right at my head level. And as I turn around and the aircraft is rolling forward, that fin catches my forehead and slices it open. Nice little gash, perfectly horizontal across my forehead. And so those of you that have had a small head injury, like a cut, you know that it bleeds like you've been shot. So blood starts gushing down my face. And so now I can't see, it's in my eyes. And the crew chief sees this. And I guess I start stumbling towards the front of the aircraft, which is bad because there's the intake there. So I hear him yelling, no, don't come this way. Turn around. But I can't see, and I don't want to turn around and get ran over by the damn landing gear. So I guess he signals to the pilot to shut the aircraft down, even though there's no chocks on it. So the aircraft shuts down, engine shuts down, and I'm stumbling all over the place. Blood is just everywhere. The crew chief's freaking out. The pilot opens the canopy, and the crew chief hadn't put the ladder up yet because he came over to check on me. So I see, the pilot's looking down like, what the hell happened? Like I didn't do it. Like I didn't do anything. I don't know what happened. I didn't do it. And I'm just like, I think the fuel tank fin got me. I think it cut my head. So the crew chief flags down the expediter truck. Expediter truck comes over there immediately. He's yelling at us. What the hell are you guys doing? We gotta catch these aircraft. What are you doing? He sees me bleeding. He's like, what the hell's his problem? We explain what happened, and he says, okay, well, hop in the truck. I'll take you down to the triage tent. Now, normally during a medical emergency on the flight line, they would either have a medical crew come out, like an EMT or something from the base, or they would just take you to the emergency room on the base. Back then, I think they still had, well, I don't know if they still have emergency rooms on base, but back then they had an ER on base. At least Shaw Air Force Base had an ER on base. And normally, if there was an emergency on the flight line, you would just go to the ER. But I don't know if because this is an exercise and, the whole base plays. The only place where you're not playing is the dormitories, the barracks, and the BX area and base housing. Everywhere else you're playing. So that includes the hospital. So I think maybe they said, okay, if something happens on the flight line, take people to the triage tent because the hospital is going to be busy during the exercise as well. So they take me to the triage tent, and my expediter, he just drops me off there because, he's busy. He got to get back and start doing all the stuff that needs to be done when the aircraft come back. So he's like, just tell him what happened, and then, report back when you're done, or have somebody, call the squadron and let us know your status. You know, because for the most part, I was fine. You know, it's just my head was cut open. I wasn't like dying or anything, but so I'm like, okay, so I go and I go in the triage tent, and there's a airman like at a desk, and he's like, yeah, just have a seat. And it's a bunch of other airmen in there. And I noticed that most of them, though, like weren't injured. They all had like these slips of paper in their hand. And so I'm just looking around, and people are looking at me because I am actually injured. I'm like bleeding. And then I realized that the slips of paper that the other airmen had were like fake injuries that the inspectors had given to them. Like, okay, you broke your arm. Go to the triage tent and tell them that you broke your arm, and then, you know, we want to see how they handle this medical emergency. But I wasn't one of those cases. I was actually like for real bleeding. So finally they get over to me, and it's a senior airman. He's like, hey, where's your paper? I'm like, I don't have a paper. And he goes, they sent you over here without a paper? Now, remember, I'm a new airman. I have no idea what's going on. I'm like, no, they just told me to come here and report back to the squadron when you guys are done to me. So he goes, okay, whatever. And he walks away. Now I'm still bleeding here. Now I'm thinking back. I'm assuming that he thought the injury was fake and they had just done a really good job of making it look real. I don't know, but he just walks away. And I'm just sitting there. I'm just sitting there bleeding. And the other men are like, you know, I don't think that's part of the exercise. I'm like, no, I'm not part of the exercise. I really got injured on the flight line. So finally, they come back and they realized how stupid they were. They thought that either they thought the triage tent was only going to be for fake injuries, or why I don't know, whatever the case is. But they patched me up. I actually needed 3 stitches. They stitched me up right there on the spot. They put a bandage around my head, or on my head, this giant bandage, and sent me back to work. And I went back to work. Oh, and they did give me a gas mask waiver, which was very cool. They said that wearing the gas mask might agitate the injury. And so I had a waiver, and I didn't have to wear my gas mask during the exercise. So I go back to work, and they didn't give me the day off. They were like, can you catch aircraft? I'm like, yeah, I guess. I didn't want to, but there was other stuff that needed to be done. So they put me back to work immediately, and I made good use of that gas mask waiver. It was awesome. The next time that we had a red where we were under attack, and you know, I put the rest of my mop gear on, what they call mopping up. I mopped up, but I just didn't have my gas mask on, and we're sitting in the tent. And of course, an inspector comes in, and he sees me. He makes a beeline towards me. He's ready to rip me one. And he's like, where's your gas mask? And I just smile and hand him my waiver. And he looks at me, and he looks at the bandage on my head, and he just hands it back to me and walks out of the tent. And he doesn't even say anything. So yeah, that was the first of quite a few Viper bites. That was maybe, I don't know if that was the worst one, actually. I've got another story I'll tell you guys later. One that was a little bit more permanent. I've got 2 Viper bites. Well, no, one's an A10 bite, one's a Warthog bite. But I've got some Viper bites that have stuck with me for the last 20 years or so. So I hope you enjoyed this video, my story. I hope you enjoyed the DCS mission playing in the background, on which I totally botched it and did a Navy style landing at the end. And hopefully you'll join me down the line, because I got a bunch of stories that you guys, and I think you like to hear. Thanks a lot. If you like it, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later. Take care.